Holmes wonders what would lead a young man my son's age to get on a ship with nitroglycerin and risk his life for the cause. What would lead somebody to do that? And those are questions we have to ask, right? That had to be asked. And Holmes, in my telling, Holmes asks those questions.
That was the voice of Terry Golway, author of the new Sherlock Holmes novel, Terror from America, recorded at our first self-produced live event, Fresh Stew Live at Ernie O'Malley's in downtown Manhattan. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. You know, we've been doing the stew for a while now with studio mics, headphones, the usual setup. A few weeks ago, we tried something different.
Yeah, we put out chairs, brought in a fiddler, Eileen McLean, to set the Irish and Sherlockian mood, and actor Mick Malamphy to add his dramatic flair to readings from Terry's book, and invited our listeners to come and be part of it.
We sold out the place 2 weeks before the event, and on the night of, we welcomed familiar faces, past guests like Larry Kerwin, Maura Claire, and Peter Quinn, new faces, people who've been listening since the early season, and people who just started listening to the stew.
And that's what Irish Stew is supposed to be. Conversation for the global Irish nation, not simply a podcast, but also a community that engages.
Well, Fresh Stew Live was all of that, and Terry Golway, it turned out, was exactly the right guest for the occasion.
So here's Mick Malamphy to get the evening started.
John Lee and Martin Nutty. You're all well warmed up. And featuring tonight's special guest, Mr. Terry Golway. Now, before we begin tonight, I'd like to thank all of our guests, our friends and supporters for joining us. Please turn off your cell phones or turn them on mute, because it isn't a play where you get away with just interrupting the play and you go, oh, whatever. It's a podcast, so we can't have your little diddly-oo-doo-doos going off in the middle of the podcast. So shut them off if you don't mind. You all got some tickets on the way in. One is for drinks, and I reckon they're all probably gone at the cut of the lottie. And the second one is for a raffle. We're raffling off a ticket for two for the next season of the Irish Rep. Any play that happens over the next 12 months at the Irish Rep. And then the second one is a signed copy of Terry Golway's book, Terror from America. We also have the main prize is a bottle of Smuggling Nun, generously donated by Maura Claire, the Queen of Pochine herself. Standing ovation for that one. There you go. Thank you. And now to officially kick off the evening, please continue the warm welcome to the marvellous hosts with the mosts of Irish Stew, John Lee and Martin Nutty.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Great to see familiar faces, new faces, and thank you, Mick. We'll be hearing a bit more from you as the evening goes on. And to our fiddler, Eileen McLean, the hardest working fiddler in showbiz today. She'll be back a couple more times before the evening is over. Martin, take it away.
So, thank you. I always like to start with a couple of fuckle because... And that's not a swear. No. A couple of fuckle, if you don't speak Irish, means a couple of words. So let's start here. Let's talk about our distinguished guest. Terry Golway was born on Staten Island, the son of a New York City firefighter. He got his first job in the sports department of the Staten Island Advance on the day before he graduated from high school. That was 1973. He hasn't stopped since then. Mm-hmm. He spent 2 decades at the New York Observer, for those of you that remember that lovely pink paper, as a reporter, an editor, a columnist. He sat on the editorial board of the New York Times. He has a Ph.D. in American history from Rutgers, and he teaches at the College of Staten Island, the place where he went to college. He's written more than a dozen books. featuring luminaries of New York and Irish American history. So I'll just shout out a few of them. John Devoy, and actually he's not a luminary, but it's a building, Tammany Hall. FDR, Al Smith, first Irish Catholic to run for president, first Catholic to run for president. And Fiorella LaGuardia. Terry knows this city and he knows what the Irish built in it. Tonight, though, we're doing something totally different, which did perplex me when Terry first floated it to me. It's a novel. It's not history, but maybe it is. It's set in New York in 1885, but in this book, Sherlock Holmes has come to New York City, and we will let him explain why as we go along. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can make a lot of noise, a big boola bus, which means clap your hands in Gaelic, for Terry Golway. So let's start here. Terry introduced me to a new word, Sherlockian. What was your first Sherlockian moment?
It was a long time ago in another world. I was mentioning actually to a few people earlier that I first encountered Sherlock Holmes by accident. I had seen Basil Rathbone, but that's not really Sherlock Holmes. Sorry, Jeremy Brett. But when I was in high school, I had a magnificent English teacher. I literally would take any class he taught. And because I was at a very distinguished high school on Staten Island, that is not a contradiction in terms, called Monsignor Farrell High School, my teacher, John Sonic, taught a class in my senior year called The Fiction of A.C. Doyle. No idea. A.C. Doyle, no idea. A.C. Doyle, of course, is the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes. So I took the class, and here I am. I've written my own, right? So it really starts in high school with a terrific teacher. And, that's how a lot of things start, right?
So Terry, how'd you get to be so Irish?
Am I? My wife, who is sitting here, is more Irish, and my son, both of them are Irish citizens. So they obviously are more Irish than I. Well, growing up on Staten Island and going to Catholic school in the 1960s, presentation nuns, wonderful teachers, despite me, they were teaching us to be Americans. There was no reference to Irish history in my 8 years in grammar school and my 4 years at Farrell, for that matter. I was an American. I was a Cold War American. The hyphen, I think, scared a lot of people back then, or maybe we thought we were over it, which I think is probably more likely. And frankly, it wasn't until, and not to get political here, but you asked me a question, right? In 1979, when the IRA killed Lord Mountbatten, I was a reporter at the Staten Island Advance looking for a byline. And for me, Lord Mountbatten, World War II, he fought on our side. He was a hero. Yeah. Why did this happen? So my parish priest, Father Morris Burke, I knew was from Ireland because he talked funny. So I thought, why not ask him? Why not start with him? Little did I know that Father Burke was the chaplain of Irish Northern Aid.
Why don't you briefly explain what that is?
Irish Northern Aid was an organization that raised money for the families of prisoners in Northern Ireland during the conflict. So I went to the rectory and I sat down with him with a tape recorder. I just wanted him I said, Father Burke, why did this happen? And just give me a little history behind it. I remember him starting off by saying, well, Terry, in the 12th century, and I remembered thinking, I don't have enough tape.
No.
But Father Burke actually is the guy who got me interested in exploring the history of Ireland. I had zero interest before that, zero. My grandfather had been from County Donegal. He died when I was very young. And again, in school, in the family, we were Americans. And so my Irish journey actually got my parents interested in their Irish roots. And my mother's father was from Donegal, as I think I mentioned. So that's how it started.
I do note that you graduated with a BA in political science. How did that fit with your first job, which I understand was writing sports stories at the Staten Island Advance? Was that part of the master plan?
There's winners and there's losers. And sometimes the winners are losers, but that's another story for another time. But actually, some of the best political writers I read growing up actually had started off as sports writers. And of course, you're going to say, like who? And my 70-year-old brain is forgetting. But I think Scotty Reston, I think James Reston, who's probably means nothing to most of you, but I think he was a sports writer, and several others. So to me, some of the best political writing was done by sports writers, and I've trashed that reputation entirely.
Looking at your career, what are some of the highlights? We want to get into Sherlock and the book pretty quickly, but what are some of the things in your journalism career, your writing career, that set you up to write a novel?
Well, as at least one person in this room would say, most of my journalism was fiction anyway. So
we'll get to Peter Quinn later.
But I was really lucky both on Staten Island when I was at the Staten Island Advance and at the New York Observer, where I had editors who pretty much said, look, you're a halfway decent writer. You've got some possibilities. Go ahead and write. That doesn't happen anymore. I really had a succession of terrific editors, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention my late great friend and editor, Peter Kaplan, who was, those of you who remember the New York Observer, remember Peter Kaplan's Observer, right? Fantastic editor. And it was he, actually he gave me a couple of ideas for my books, but it was he who said, go out and write. It doesn't get any better than that. And the New York Observer was owned by a guy named Arthur Carter, who just died last December. And Arthur Carter had my back no matter what. A quick story, I once wrote a story somewhat critical of David Dinkins when he was mayor. And David Dinkins called Arthur Carter, my boss, the guy who signed my checks, called him at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday, because that's when the Observer came out. And he was complaining about me. And Arthur said to the mayor, Dave, he talked like that, Dave, just be glad Galway's story wasn't in the New York Times. How can you not like that? I think the Observer, since I've taken so long to answer a simple question, it was the Observer experience, really, that set me off.
Reading your resume is an exercise in confusion, at least for me.
Imagine how I feel.
Because it ping-pongs back and forth between journalism and history. The old saw about journalism is that the first rough draft of history. Are you a subscriber to that notion?
I am. All these years later, since I have ping-ponged, I was also in academia for a while. Seeing how journalism is practiced from the inside, you do get an insight on the fact that we, and I include myself, how much we get wrong because we're on a deadline and we have to get stuff done. It's remarkable how much we do get right. But as a historian, I've learned to be very skeptical of reading stuff in newspapers, particularly John DeVoy's newspaper, may I add, because, well, we can get into that later. But yes, journalism certainly is the first draft of history, but it is just the first draft. And it takes trained historians to to write it to write it in a more scientific way. Although I will tell you, and hopefully nobody from Rutgers ever listens to this, but some of the best writing of history I've read has been in novels. Peter Quinn's Banished Children of Eve. If you were going to read a book about the draft riots, would you rather read some dry academic study that or would you rather read Peter Quinn? The answer? Read Peter Quinn, right?
There's a quote later on that seems to address what you're talking about. Maeve of Connaught is talking, and she was involved in a very pivotal moment in the book. She said, it's an odd sensation to be a witness to a newsworthy event, to know the truth firsthand, and then to read about it in the newspapers where facts fight a losing battle with sensation.
Right. Well, to be honest, I sort of had the Murdochian sort of school of journalism in mind when I wrote that, because really, I love being a journalist. I don't think I could have succeeded at anything else. But some journalism that I see practiced perhaps on a nightly basis on a certain news channel, some of that I just am repulsed by. So when I have Maeve as a character in the book, who is something of a poet, and she witnesses a crime, And she's now reflecting on it. She's reading about the crime in the newspapers, and the newspapers have it all wrong. And she knows the truth. So she's reflecting on that.
So just speaking of the evolution of journalism, let's take you up to the present moment.
Oh dear.
Terry has launched a Substack. For those of you that are fond of Terry Golway and want some really acerbic commentary, I recommend it strongly. But I'm curious about your take on that, because obviously journalism, print journalism especially, has been struggling. We know lots of local newspapers have shut down. There's huge consolidations. What's your view of this kind of new and emerging single shingle journalism?
Yeah, it's a world I don't recognize, although I do participate in it now. I started a Substack almost on a dare from a friend of mine earlier this year. And some people make a lot of money through Substack. Paul Krugman, the former New York Times columnist, I think he's raking it in. I refuse money because someday I'm going to wake up and say, do I play golf today? Or do I write a Substack? It's going to be golf. But for the moment, anyway, I've been able to successfully write about 19 weeks worth of stuff. I found I enjoyed it. I really thought, I'll just try this. I'm not going to like it. However, given the raw material that's out there these days, you can't miss. That being said, I write commentary. I actually call my Substack Observer, which is a bow at the New York Observer, my favorite workplace ever, but also in honor of my favorite columnist ever, Russell Baker, who wrote the Observer columnist for the New York Times for so long and won a Pulitzer Prize. And he's just sort of had this wry, dare we say, acerbic, viewed from a distance, looking at events, and that's what I try to do in my Substack. But there may be a day sometime soon where I just decide not to do it because it's no substitute for facts. There are no facts in my Substack. Right? I literally make up conversations that the President of the United States, maybe I didn't make it up. I don't know.
Sounded way too irrational to me.
So the search for truth, the search for facts is still happening. Highly trained and really professional journalists are out there working their butts off, trying to get the American people the facts. Whether they are succeeding or not is not their fault. The question is there a part of the country nowadays where facts are irrelevant? And is that part of the country, I don't know, Washington, D.C., right? But never in my lifetime has journalism been so important as it is today. And yet, as you suggest, Martin, it's struggling so much. I feel so badly for so many of my colleagues who have lost jobs or who have jobs that are ill-suited to their tremendous talents. But we need journalists now more than ever.
Well, Terry, let's move things back to the reason we're here, to sell some of your books.
Before
Okay.
we have an ice raid.
The game's afoot.
You're the immigrant, not me.
The game's afoot, so to speak. And to get into the premise of Terror from America, let's get into an early chapter to set the scene of what's going on. We'll bring Mick Malamphy back to the stage. And chapter 1, at 221B Baker Street, George Jenkins, the Assistant Undersecretary for Crime and Police in Dublin, and Sherlock's brother Mycroft, an advisor to Her Majesty's government, plead for Sherlock's help after a bombing near the London Bridge, killing the bombers, assumed to be New York Irish-American Fenians. Jenkins hands Sherlock a message he found in his office that morning, as Dr. Watson relates.
Holmes pulled a small piece of paper from the envelope, stared at it for several seconds, and then shared it with me. It consisted of a single phrase printed in large type, of the sort one sees in the headlines of newspapers. The words were quite literally foreign to me. Die ol tas don skyobaron. I shook my head and shrugged my shoulders, for I saw nothing familiar in this strange combination of letters. It's obviously in the Irish language, Holmes said, passing the note back to Jenkins. I assume you have read it and translated it, Jenkins. Jenkins nodded. It means revenge for Skibbereen. Holmes lifted his bushy eyebrows and tilted his head. Extraordinary, he muttered. Then he repeated the word. Extraordinary. I would hope any educated Englishman knows that Skibbereen is a town in Ireland, in County Cork, if memory serves. But why does it cry out for vengeance? And against whom? That will require some investigation. And now, Sherlock, you know why we are here, Mycroft said. The Prime Minister has decided that these infernal American murder societies need to be broken up on their side of the Atlantic, not on ours, when it is often too late to take preemptive action. This latest provocation has put some steel in the grand old man's spine. He paused for a moment and let out a deep sigh. Perhaps he is having second thoughts about giving amnesty to all those blasted Fenians back in, what was it, 71? Yes, 71. The worst of them went to New York and simply resumed their activities. I'm thinking, Jenkins, two of the men whose names surely are familiar to you, John Devoy, who fancies himself a journalist, and his one-time cellmate, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, who also publishes some sort of newspaper and openly recruits foolish young men for bombing missions. They are allowed to finance and plan their attacks on our public facilities with impunity, since it seems the American government has little interest in deterring them. Were it not for Mr. Gladstone, those two men would still be rotting in Millbank or some other god-forsaken place where they belong.
Yeah. Thank you, Mill. So, Terry, I would think for some people saying, I'm going to write a Sherlock Holmes novel is like saying, I'm going to write a Shakespeare play. I mean, you're up against a pretty discriminating audience of Sherlockians looking to see if they can accept you into the canon. An awesome responsibility.
I asked myself to write or not to write.
Da-dum-dum.
Well played.
And I decided to write. Yes, you're right. Well, first of all, I did feel competent to write a Sherlock Holmes novel because of John Sonic, my Farrell High School teacher, but also because I had read every story multiple times. And frankly, I love them, and I love the Jeremy Brett BBC series of the 1980s. He was a great Sherlock Holmes. So I wasn't intimidated by the idea, but running into Sherlockians, that's intimidating. So I had one read the manuscript, and I said, look, just be easy with me. Just tell me if there's anything that jumps out at you. And he actually had a couple of good suggestions. But then at one point he said, but listen, I have to stop you right here. Because he said several times, Sherlock refers to the fact that he's wondering if Professor Moriarty, his villain, right, and Colonel Moran, who was Moriarty's henchman. So several times Holmes points out to Watson, you know, those are Irish names. We should think about that. So the Sherlockian said to me, there's no way Sherlock Holmes would have said that in 1885. He wouldn't have said that till 1887.
Oh, boy.
To which my response was, you know, this is fiction. You know, he wasn't real, right?
What?
Yeah.
Let's look around the room we're in. This is the most Fenian room in New York City. And this is where Sherlock Holmes is heading into. And the question is, how do we get the great detective to infiltrate New York's Fenian underground? And we found a clue later in that first chapter that Mick was reading from.
Now, if you will excuse me, my violin is calling, even at this early hour. Some music may help sort out these problems. He retreated to the bedroom, where he kept his Stradivarius. I settled into the armchair and returned to my newspapers, expecting to hear the familiar strains of one of Holmes' favorite German composers. I was guessing Schumann, for it seemed like a Schumann moment, filled with darkness and mystery. Instead, I heard something quite different, something new in the Holmes repertoire. Ah, you know that. Really? It was London Derriere. That familiar tune I always considered to be a little more than a vulgar dirge filled with the worst sort of Gaelic sentimentality. In Holmes' sensitive hands, though, However, it became lovely and bittersweet, its high notes lamenting the loss of something well loved. It was as though I was hearing it for the first time. I found myself strangely and unexpectedly moved.
We'll skip ahead a little bit in the story as Holmes writes back to Watson from New York on how he's using his newfound Irish fiddling skills to infiltrate the Fenians of New York.
You will be delighted to learn that I'm gainfully employed. A description few in Scotland Yard would associate with me. My fiddle has won me a spot with an itinerant group of buskers who travel the local shebeens and clubhouses in search of a few shillings for a night's work. Among our presumably satisfied customers are the members of the Napa Tandy chapter of the infamous Clan na Gael organisation, which sponsors a Saturday night musical session for members and their guests. It is a clever tactic, Watson, for it gives the organisation the veneer of innocence for what could be the harm in providing the local proletariat with an occasional night of colour and remembrance in their otherwise dull and unforgiving lives. But there's a group of men, separate and apart from the revellers, and their business clearly seems to be anything but musical in nature. I brought the evening to a close with my rendition of London Derriere, that bittersweet lament which unfailingly brings a tear to any Irishman worth his porter and potatoes. I could not help but notice that even the granite-faced Devoy appeared to be moved, though he shielded himself from scrutiny by lowering his head and making a study of the hall's linoleum floor.
Thank you, Eileen. And we're going to give her a round of applause because she has to get to her next gig a few blocks away.
So, hands up, how many people knew that melody was the London Derriere?
I was told not to say Londonderry within this room.
It was composed quite a while before Danny Boy, which probably everybody knows in this room. But there's a reference made that Mick was kindly reading there about John Devoy, and I think John Devoy was a pretty seminal figure in your life, Terry, because while you're being a journalist, you decide to write a biography of John Devoy. And he is obviously a significant figure in this book as well. So tell me why you chose to tackle Devoy.
It's another story about a person having an influence over somebody's life and maybe not even realizing it. I was at some Irish function, and a woman who used to run Keshkerrigan Books named Angela Carter. Some of you remember Angela, right? She had this wonderful bookstore on Chambers Street and then later relocated somewhere else. But anyway, she cornered me at some function. I almost want to think it was when President Robinson was on Ellis Island. I think that might have been the event, like 1992 or so. And she comes up to me and peered at me with glasses down like that. And she said, "Terry, I have a book for you, John Devoy." And that was all she had to tell me, because I knew a little bit about John Devoy. And I knew that he was born before the famine. I knew that he had survived the famine by moving to Dublin, although his mother died, presumably, of some sort of famine-related illness. That he tried to participate in the Fenian Rising, so I knew the outlines of Devoy's biography. And he almost lives to see Al Smith nominated for president in 1928. Somebody born before the famine and lives to 1928, who is involved in the Easter Rising, who's involved with Parnell in the 1880s. And I just thought, this is genius, right? Because through Devoy's life, you could tell the story of Ireland and Irish America from pre-famine all the way to 1928. So Angela's the one I have to thank for that. It was her idea, and it took me a number of years to execute because I was working full-time. And also, if you go to the National Library of Ireland, which is a wonderful, wonderful building and a place, but if you were to say to ask for the John Devoy papers, someone would probably say in their Brooklyn accent, "How much time you got?" because there's a lot of papers. I was there for almost a month. We had a newborn baby when I went there, right? Katie was a child, a baby. Eileen let me go. Eileen encouraged me to go. Eileen wanted me to go. And so I did. And luckily, too, some of DuBois' papers were available at several facilities here in New York. But it was DuBois' compelling personality, but also the span of his life, which told me that this was a great story.
So, what do you get to say in a fictionalized account of John DuBois' life that you can't say in a history book?
Everything.
Okay, in this Sherlockian adventure.
Well, I think I make him out to be very crabby on occasion, right? Which I think he really was in real life, but very unsentimental. There was a sentimental bone in John DuBois' life, in his being. And while he doesn't say that in his letters, hi, I'm unsentimental, right? But you can read between the lines. So in his actions, in his relations with other people, he is totally practical, let's get the job done. So historically speaking, at the time of the novel, DuBois is trying to get Irish America behind Charles Parnell, a politician, right? And Republican dogma has it, or had it, that you don't work with constitutional politicians, that the only answer is violence, right? But DuBois understands that Irish America has reached a point in 1885 where if we can get the clerics, if we can get Tammany Hall, if we can get the politicians behind something called home rule. And what is home rule? Well, we'll think about that later, right? So he's being very practical about this. He's put aside his oath to the Irish Republican Brotherhood in pursuit of something very practical. Meanwhile, his former cellmate, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rasa, is after him in his newspaper, accusing him of all sorts of heresies and crimes, because Rasa's answer is that we have to keep blowing things up. So that tension between Rasa and DuBois, I explore in the book, where I couldn't really get at it when I just had to deal with facts, because I didn't want to make assumptions, and frankly, not to get into academia, but there are some cultural historians out there these days who I feel I want to say to them, that's a good book, but you really just should write a novel, because there's no facts in here, and they should. Because as I've said before, I think you can learn as much about history through a novel, like mine, like others, Tom Flanagan's, than you can in a history book.
Well, you build these stories around a lot of real people, real history. And we're so fortunate that one of those characters from the 1880s is in the room here today. You refer to him, he says, Sherlock is saying, here we are, a book I found in my wanderings earlier this week called The Lives of the Fenians by the eminent Irish writer Peter Quinn. He's right back there. He goes, Watson says, I was embarrassed to say I was unfamiliar with this eminent writer. And Sherlock is, you miss the irony in my voice, Watson. Mr. Peter Quinn is obscure, save to connoisseurs of the greenish sort of purple prose. He is the low-rent Boswell for any number of Irish rebels. And with all that, he blurbed your damn book.
If you buy Peter enough Irish whiskey, you can get him to say anything.
But as a historian who mostly dealt with facts until this book, did the historical framework give you a comfort zone to kind of work off in exploring fiction?
Yeah. I know this sounds like I'm bragging, but I felt I was in my wheelhouse dealing with 1885 New York, dealing with Tammany. Like there's a character in the book, Charles Francis Murphy, who in my nonfiction life is a major part of my book about Tammany Hall. One of the most neglected historical figures in New York. Everybody talks about Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed. I mean, Boss Tweed was boss of Tammany for 5 years, maybe. Charlie Murphy was boss of Tammany Hall from 1902 to 1924, and he gave New York Al Smith and Robert Wagner. Not bad work, right? So Charlie Murphy is a character, Tammany is a character. In the book, Thomas Burns, the Sherlock Holmes of New York. That's what he was in real life, or so he was called. So I felt that I got that time period.
Going back, you have arrogantly assumed that you can assume the shape of Arthur Conan Doyle. And I'm curious, being a historian, I think you might have probed Arthur Conan Doyle's background, because those of you that know, Doyle is actually an Irish name. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about stepping into his shoes, and is there any evidence that in any way that he identified as Irish at all?
Well, he was Jesuit educated, if that means anything, right?
So he was troubled.
There's one story in the Holmes canon where, well, there are two. First of all, he wrote a novel called The Valley of Fear, which is about Irish Americans in Pennsylvania. It's basically about the Molly Maguires. And the hero in The Valley of Fear is the turncoat, right? Is the spy who turns in the Molly Maguires. But also, I don't think it was the last novel, or the last short story, but it was near the last, called His Last Bow or His Last Bow. I'm not quite sure what. But in that book, in that short story, Holmes and Watson are getting together after several years of retirement. Watson says he hadn't seen Holmes in a while. But in that short story, Holmes is disguised as an Irish American who is working with the Germans who are spying on the British on the eve of World War I. And in it, I forget how Watson gets into the picture, and then they reunite, and Watson says, you know, I was in Chicago in 1912, basically spying on the Fenians in Chicago. So if this book meets any low expectations, and there's a clamor from my wife for me to write another one so I can get out of her hair for a while, whatever. I already have my sequel. Doyle gave it to me. Sherlock Holmes in America on the eve of World War I as the Irish are planning the Easter Rising. There you go.
There was a section at the end that really popped out for me, and I'll read it here. Sherlock speaking, summing up some of the things that he had observed. The Fenians, who inhabit the back rooms of New York's clubhouses and taverns, like a room like this, bear little resemblance to the crude caricatures portrayed in some less reputable newspapers. Formidable not because of their capacity for mayhem, but because of the power they yield over the production of memories. Against all odds, they have found ways to preserve their identity in America. That's kind of what we're about here at Irish Stew.
Absolutely. And I think my telling of the story, Holmes comes to America wanting to know. In fact, I think at one point, it's either Holmes or Watson says, what would drive people to do this? Because the original crime, and this is based on something that actually happened, several Irish Americans were going to try to blow up London Bridge. Now, London Bridge is not Tower Bridge. Everybody thinks it is. London Bridge is just a normal bridge, and they blew themselves up. Right? And in my telling, Holmes wonders what would lead a young man my son's age to get on a ship with nitroglycerin and risk his life for the cause. What would lead somebody to do that? And those are questions we have to ask, right? That had to be asked. And Holmes, in my telling, Holmes asks those questions. And often when I have Holmes asking questions like that, the voice I'm hearing is not the voice of A.C. Doyle. It's actually the voice of Jeremy Brett, and it's the voice of Christopher Plummer, who played Sherlock Holmes in a movie that I know some people didn't like, but it was called Murder by Decree, where Holmes is trying to track down Jack the Ripper, and he tears apart this fiction and realizes that the British government is at the heart of the conspiracy. Now, whether you believe that or not, but late in the movie, Christopher Plummer, Sherlock Holmes, challenges the British establishment. He actually challenges the obvious Gladstone character. At one point, the Gladstone character says, "And what shall I do, Mr. Holmes? Shall I resign?" And Christopher Plummer says, "Yes, resign." "And if I had the power, I would compel you." That's the Sherlock I wanted in my pages. Whether I succeeded or not is up to you.
He was nobody's fool.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting aspects of this book. There's lots of pressure being applied to him politically.
Yes.
One of the characters that is in the book is the father of Winston Churchill.
Yes,
Randolph Churchill.
Yep.
And I'm curious about the take, because my history isn't as strong as yours. But the plot device that you're using is that Randolph Churchill wants to tie Charles Parnell, who is this parliamentarian that's trying to peacefully change things, to the dynamite plot. Now, how much fiction, how much fact?
It's mostly fact. I mean, in fact, it's thoroughly factual, right? The British government tried on several occasions through forging letters to show that Parnell was in league with Devoy and Rossin. Now, he was in league with Devoy, right? But Devoy was about peace back then, right? But the British establishment wanted to discredit Parnell. Now, Randolph Churchill maybe wasn't involved to the extent that I have him involved. But remember, at one point, Randolph Churchill, who sees himself as a future prime minister, at this point, he is up and coming. He wasn't in the government yet, but he's on his way to being Chancellor of the Exchequer. He said in 1886 about the Irish situation, he says, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right, meaning that the Irish Protestants would fight Home Rule. So he was against Home Rule. In my telling, he's manipulating Holmes because he's telling Holmes, I want you to find the link between these Irish dynamiters and Parnell. At one point, Holmes says, well, what's the evidence? He says, find it.
One of the things that I love about historical fiction, and this is what this is with a beloved character that we all know, is it is actually an entry point into history. And I can't recommend this book strongly enough because it makes you ask the questions just like I just asked right now, is to what degree Churchill was involved to try and discredit Parnell, because that encourages you then to go back. So it sets out an interesting framework of this time that maybe isn't as well known as it should be, because on one level it's not that violent a time. It's not the 1916 Rising with things in flames, nor is it the rather pathetic Fenian Rising in Ireland. So I can't recommend this book strongly enough as an entry point to understanding something of the actual Irish-American experience, and it's, guess what, it's damn entertaining.
Speaking of entertaining, let's bring Mick up to close out this portion of the program with a reading late in the novel from the diaries of John Devoy.
I told Parnell that I could move Irish America in his favour if we could agree on certain conditions, including his backing for Irish self-government. I noticed a brightening in his otherwise neutral gaze when I said Irish self-government. Such a wonderfully vague phrase, and one I choose deliberately to appeal to as many people as possible. Did I mean an independent republic? A form of home rule within the empire? Something in between? I'd leave it to others to interpret as they saw fit. Parnell listened carefully. He was dressed as one would expect of a landed gentleman. A fine woolen jacket, vest and trousers, black leather boots well shined, a dark silk tie and spotless collar. His thin lips disappeared into a bushy beard, full, and his moustache, appropriate enough for a man who gave away little with his mouth. I assured him I could deliver American support for his causes and at the same time kick aside extremists like Rossa and the other hotheads. The hair around Parnell's lips parted long enough to form the phrase, very interesting. And that was the extent of it. He came to America a year later and went on a cross-country tour to raise money for his party. I shared the stage with him for a rally in Madison Square Garden one night as we raised thousands of dollars. And I was delighted when this virtual Englishman told the audience, the American people are now the arbiters of the Irish question. I'm not particularly emotional, but I almost had tears in my eyes when I heard those words. That was exactly what we in New York wish to be, the arbiters of the Irish question. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gents, so Terry's going to be here signing at the desk. And we can all go outside, have a drink, relax, and just maybe form a line, come up one by one. But I just want to close out by thanking you all for coming to Fresh Stew, Irish Stew Live. And please give a big, big boola bus once more for Martin Nutty, John Lee, and our wonderful guest, Terry Golway. Thank you.
And for Mick Polanski, who not only did the readings, helped us pull this whole evening together as our producer.
Thank you. Cheers.
Well, Martin, a couple of takeaways from our conversation with Terry Golway. First, we saw that fiction is sometimes the most honest way into history. And second, that the Irishmen in the back rooms of New York's shebeens in 1885 were not the crude caricatures that the newspapers in England made them out to be, and that Sherlock Holmes sagely discerned. Formidable because of the power they had over memory. That line could have been written about this community today.
Can't agree with that more. Now, the one thing that you do want to do is get yourself a copy of Terror from America. It's available wherever you buy books. Just go get it. And you can also track down Terry's Substack called Observer if you want to find the kind of commentary that the current mood demands and rarely gets. You'll find links to both in our show notes.
And of course, thanks to our media partner, Irish Central. They spread the word on this episode and every episode we produce. If you want to stay connected with all things Irish, make sure you visit irishcentral.com. That link is in the show notes too.
And thank you to Mick Malamphy, performer, producer, and the man who kept the evening on schedule. And to Eileen McLean on fiddle, who opened and closed out her portion of the night with exactly the right tone. And no Irish gathering will be complete without a raffle. So thank you to the Irish Rep for donating 2 tickets to any show they'll be hosting in the next 12 months. To our guest, Terry Golway, who gave an inscribed copy of Terror from America, and to Maura Clare of Smuggling Nun Pochine, who contributed a bottle of her very finest.
A big thanks to Uilleann Piper, Chris Byrne. He joined us for Fresh Stew Live, and then he wandered out to the front of the bar and led a great trad session. He gave people a good reason to hang around, enjoy the hospitality of Ernie O'Malley's, and he gave us the great send-off that we were hoping for.
And the staff of Ernie O'Malley's, who hosted the whole thing with genuine hospitality. That matters. And let's say we made Monday night not feel like a Monday night.
Yeah, it was popping in there. Finally, we want to thank everybody who did make it pop at Ernie O'Malley's, who came out on their Monday evening to Fresh Stew Live on June 1st. Irish Stew is a show, but also a gathering. You showed up and you made it real.
We're going to do this again in the fall. So why don't you follow Irish Stew now, wherever you listen? You'll be first in line when we announce it.
And remember, we were sold out 2 weeks in advance. Until then, Slán.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Martin Nutty. Additional editing by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.